A warm greetings to all the 4th semester botany students. I am Dr. K.Y. Pratibha, and in this session I would like to talk on the structure of the male gametophyte. Pollen grains or the microspore is the first cell of male gametophyte. Pollen grain is haploid, unicellular, uninucleate, microscopic, and they are oval in their shape. Pollen grains are formed from the microspore mother cells after meiosis. Pollen grains are usually spherical in shape, measuring about 25 to 50 micrometers in diameter. Pollen grain is covered by two wall layers, outer exine and inner intine. Outer exine is thick, rigid, and ornamented, whereas inner intine is soft, elastic. Outer exine is formed of sporopollenin. The inner intine is made up of pectocellulosic. At few places on the outer surface, exine is absent, and these places are called germ pore. Germ pore plays an essential part in the fertilization of plants. It helps in pollen tube formation and releases the microgamete during fertilization. The exine is chemically differentiated into two layers, an outer layer called extexine and an inner layer called endexine. Extexine is further comprised of tectum, bacula, and foot layer. Each pollen grain contains a vegetative cell and a generative cell. In flowering plants, the vegetative tube cell produces the pollen tube and the generative cell divides to form two sperm nuclei. Dear students, the pollen grain are the first cell of the male gametophyte. They are uninucleate, they are haploid, they are unicellular, and they are oval in shape. They are made up of two wall layer, outer exine, inner intine. Exine is made up of sporopollenin. Intine is made up of pectocellulosic nature, and the exine is further divided into outer extexine, inner endexine. Outer extexine is further divided into tectum, bacula, and foot layer, and inside the pollen grain, inside the pollen grain cell, the cytoplasm will be there. This cytoplasm nucleus divides unequally to form the larger vegetative cell and a smaller generative cell. The larger vegetative cell or a tube cell is going to form the pollen tube. The generative cell is going to form the two sperm cells. Now let us take up the structure of vegetative cell in detail. So in this session we are going to study the structure of vegetative cell, generative cell, and we are going to learn about the concept called as male germ unit concept. So let us take up the vegetative cell. After pollen mitosis, the vegetative cell continues to grow and the cell organelles, vacuoles increases in number. Vegetative cell is bigger in size with a large nucleus. Vegetative cell performs the metabolic functions. It stores reserve food for the pollen grain and delivers the gametes to the embryo sac of the ovule. Vegetative cell is doing multitasking. It not only protects, it carries the generative cell and the male gametes to the embryo sac, and also it helps in nourishment. It stores reserve food for the developing male gametes. The vegetative cell nucleus undergoes considerable changes and becomes lobed at maturity. Vegetative cell plays a crucial role in pollen tube formation and sperm delivery. It is very important in the pollen tube formation and helping the male gametes to reach the destination. The vegetative cell has following stages: developmental stages, immature stage, mature stage, stage before pollen dehiscence, and pollen tube stage. So the vegetative cell is highly it keeps changing. It does not stick to one structure. It is highly dynamic in its growth. The vegetative cell has I told you 4 stages. In immature stage, the nucleus of the vegetative cell begins to lose its spherical shape. In the beginning, the spherical nature starts losing in the vegetative cell, and it starts storing the starch in the mature stage. And the stage before anthrodescence, the nucleus becomes lobed and no starch in plastic. And in the pollen tube stage, vegetative cell forms a pollen tube after pollination. Vegetative cell can also be called as tube cell, and vegetative nucleus can also be called as tube nucleus. So in this picture you will see the various changes that are happening in the vegetative cell. Its nucleus becomes highly lobed, and in the last stage the vegetative cell is going to form the pollen tube, and in the pollen tube its nucleus, that is tube nucleus, will be at the tip, and behind the tube nucleus you will find the 2 sperm cells. So it takes responsibility in delivering the 2 sperms to the embryo sac. So let us go to the generative cell. The generative cell is either cut off inner side or on the outer side. So always generative cell will be formed towards the side because of unequal mitosis. I had told you in the previous session. The generative cell soon loses contact with the wall of the microspore and come to life freely in the vegetative cell. So in the beginning, the generative cell is towards the side of the pollen grain, but afterwards it comes to lie in the center of the vegetative cell. Immediately after detachment, the generative cell is spherical. However, it keeps changing its shapes like elliptical, lenticular, spindle shaped or vermiform, which has also been observed so as to facilitate its movement in the pollen tube. The generative cell contains all usual cell organelles except plastids with few exceptions. The nucleus is smaller but contains higher amount of DNA. Cytoplasm is highly reduced in generative cell. The generative cell either divides when the pollen are still within the anther, or it may take place. The division of the generative cell may take after the pollen discharge in the style region of the gynoecium. In 70% of the angiosperm plants, pollen is released at 2-cell stage. In 30% of the plant, pollen is shed at the 3-cell stage. The generative cell is contained within the large pollen tube cell. Upon germination, the tube cell forms the pollen tube through which the generative cell migrates to enter the ovary. During the transit inside the pollen tube, the generative cell divides to form 2 male gametes. The generative cell of the pollen grain divides mitotically and forms 2 non-motile. Please pay attention. 2 haploid non-motile gametes or sperm cells are produced. Non-motile male gametes or sperm cells are produced. Double fertilization is a chief trait of angiosperm plants. Now let us understand what is the fate of these 2 male gametes or sperms produced. In angiosperms, both the sperms are used for the fertilization. In this phenomenon, one of the male gametes fertilizes with the egg, resulting in the formation of zygote, and the other male gamete unites with the 2 polar nuclei for the formation of an endosperm. So both the male gametes formed by the generative cells are used in the fertilization process. Now let us briefly know the differences between the vegetative cell and the generative cell. Vegetative cell forms pollen tube. Vegetative cell is non-reproductive. Vegetative cells contain small amount of DNA but more amount of protein. It has more reserve food. It has large nucleolus. It has diffuse chromatin, and vegetative cell has short-lived cytoplasm. Compared to that, the generative cell forms 2 sperms. It is reproductive in functions, contain actively dividing nucleus with high amount of DNA and small amount of protein. It does not have much of the reserve food material. It has small nucleolus and it has highly condensed chromatin, and the generative cell has long-lived cytoplasm. These are the photographs of 2-cell pollen grain in Lilium. You can see the generative cell as well as the vegetative cell in this picture. So let us go to the another concept now, male germ unit concept, another terminology. Male germ unit consists of a stable association between the vegetative nucleus and two sperm cells. So it is an association, that is the assembling of the vegetative nucleus with the two sperm cells is called as male germ unit. It is studied in siamese and many angiosperms. This reproductive unit is transported within the pollen tube and delivered to the embryo sac. As a unit, two sperms and vegetative nucleus move in the pollen tube. In angiosperm, the sperm cells and their interaction with the vegetative cell nucleus to form a functional assemblage is termed as male germ unit. The formulation of the male germ unit is essential and prerequisite for the successful completion of the unique process of double fertilization. So it is very much important for the process of double fertilization. MGU functions like a single coordinated unit. That's very important. It acts as a one unit. Two sperms are linked by a common cross wall and lie in a common enclosure. So the two sperms here are linked by a common cross wall and lie in a common enclosure. Out of the two sperms, one of the sperm is connected to vegetative nucleus through cytoskeleton extension. So you can see the organization, one vegetative nucleus and two sperm cells, how they are interconnected and how they function as one coordinated unit is called as male germ unit. The organization of MGU is highly specific, and which sperm will take part in syngamy and triple fusion is predetermined. The male gamete which is not connected to the vegetative nucleus fuse with the egg, while the male gamete connected to the vegetative nucleus will going to fuse with the central cell. So there is lot of predetermined function. So the sperm which is not attached to the vegetative nucleus will fuse with the egg, whereas the sperm which is attached to the vegetative nucleus will fuse with the polar nuclei or the secondary nuclei of the female embryo sac. So if you see this picture, you will see the beautiful organization of vegetative nucleus with the generative cell which is going to form the two sperm cells, and how in the pollen tube, if you see this picture, the vegetative nucleus is the first to enter the pollen tube. It will be always at the tip of the pollen tube. So when it is going in the pollen tube, how nicely it is pulling the sperm cells along with that. The two sperm cells are also moving with the vegetative nucleus. So this organization of the vegetative nucleus with the sperm cell is called as male germ unit concept. Okay, let's revise what we have studied in this session. We have studied that pollen grain or microspore is considered as first cell of male gametophyte. Further, this pollen grain undergoes first mitotic division to form vegetative cell which is bigger and a generative cell which is smaller, and larger one of this is vegetative cell and smaller one is generative cell. The vegetative cell has abundant reserve food material and it has a regular shaped nucleus, whereas generative cell is small spindle shaped and it floats in the cytoplasm of the vegetative cell. The generative cell is cell within the cell. Generative cell divides to form two male gametes, thus making pollen three-celled. Each pollen grain has prominent two-layered wall. The outer layer is called exine, the inner layer is called intine, and in male germ unit concept, the vegetative nucleus is connected with the two sperms or the male gametes, and they act as one coordinated unit during the process of fertilization. So this is called as male germ unit concept.